So this weekend we hear from the prophet Malachi, and in the entire 3-year liturgical cycle of the church, we only hear from Malachi twice. And interestingly, today's reading is the shortest Old Testament reading in the whole 3-year cycle. It's only a verse and a half in length. And the whole book of Malachi, if you were to read it, it's the last book in the Old Testament. It's only about 1,600 words. It's only a little bit longer than the homily, actually, that you are about to hear. It was probably written around 460 BC or so, and it was at a time when the religious fervor of the Israelites seemed to have cooled, and the community seemed to be adrift. And in that short passage today, Malachi addresses a concern that has been echoed really throughout the ages, even in our time, and namely that it seemed in his time as he was writing that evildoers are triumphing and the righteous losing. But Malachi assures us that ultimately the opposite will happen. The righteous will triumph, and evildoers will be judged. So what we do matters. And then Paul, in his own way and in his own circumstances, stresses to his readers the need for steady perseverance in carrying out the demands of the Christian life, our Christian faith. You know, the early writings of the New Testament, and 2 Thessalonians was be among that group, probably written not more than 20 years after Jesus died and rose. Those early writings are very much concerned with what they believed was the imminent end of the world and the return of Christ in judgment. Well, we know that they were wrong in the way they thought about it. And even before the New Testament was completed, the later books indicate that the end is not so soon. The emphasis had shifted from an expectation of an early return of Jesus to focus on how fruitfully we ought to spend the time in waiting. And among other things in the passage today, Paul talks to his listeners about the significance of work. And you know, Catholic thought has given a lot of attention to the idea of work since the time of the Thessalonian letters. So work is not just something we engage in to keep ourselves away from the troubles we might lapse into when we are idle. Nor is it just a task that we perform in order to earn a living. Work, whether it's paid employment or not, has a central and a positive part to play in our lives in the Lord. It is the very contribution that each of us makes to the development and the unfolding of creation. God left much of the task of bringing the world to fulfillment to us human creatures. And we engage in that task by the words and the actions of our work life, by the way we bring together and modify the elements of creation that God has given us. Think about it. Each day, the world is a little different because of all the work that human beings have done. And that difference is our human contribution to the created reality that God has entrusted to us. The work that we do matters. So we might ask, what is the point if all of this is coming to a crashing halt, as Jesus seems to be explaining in today's gospel? Well, it might help us to understand Jesus' words, to also understand that the strongly held belief of most first century Jews and virtually all early Christians, and hopefully us too for that matter, that history was going somewhere. And it was going somewhere under the guidance of God. And where it was going was toward God's new world, God's new creation, we might say, of justice and healing and hope. And I wonder if Jesus is letting them know in colorful language that a massive reorientation of everything that they thought they knew was coming, and that this would usher in that new world that had been the object of their longing for centuries. By the time Luke's gospel was written, the temple had indeed been destroyed, but perhaps more importantly, the day had come when indeed humanity experienced in Jesus' death and resurrection that what had seemed impossible in human terms was possible for God. Death does not have the final word. That changed everything. God's love is more powerful even than death. And all of those institutions that are based upon the fear of death, that changes everything. God's new world of justice and joy, of healing and hope for the whole earth, that new world was launched that day when Jesus came out of the tomb on Easter morning. And he calls us now, his followers, to live in him, and by the power of the Holy Spirit, to be new creation people here and now, bringing signs and symbols of heaven, of the kingdom, to birth in the circumstances of our lives, here on earth as in heaven. The final coming together of heaven and earth is, of course, God's supreme act of new creation. And the only real prototype we have for that, except, I suppose, for the act of creation itself, was the resurrection of Jesus. So while it is true that God builds God's kingdom, it is also true that God ordered his world in such a way that his own work within that world takes place significantly through you and through me, fashioned in God's image, called upon to reflect that image in how we live our lives. The Creator works in 1,000 ways, but imagine this. One central way is through people. People who think and who pray and who make difficult decisions and who work hard. Each of us is called in the present to share the hope of God's new creation. It's our individual mission as Christians. It's the mission of the church. And here's the thing. All of this will find its way through the resurrecting power of God into that new creation, into that kingdom in its fullness that God will one day make. That's why what we do matters and is so important. That is the shape of our Christian hope. Hope cannot be defeated finally by any present evil, because hope is our heart's commitment to the lives yet to be. So what we do matters. And here's to close. Here's how you might think practically about how this hope gets planted. One day, in the fullness of time, someone will come up to you and thank you for the way you touched his or her life. And the person's words will take you completely by surprise. And soon another person will seek you out. And then another. And another. And as you listen to each one's story, you will begin to discover all the ways that God used your life, even when you were unaware of it. And you will find that it was most often not so much through the big things you did, but through the small and simple things. A spoken word that was not planned. A spontaneous act of kindness, a loving attitude, or a caring smile. To your joy, you will discover that in all these ways and more, God used you to deposit an eternal measure of his love into many needy hearts. He is using you in more ways than you can ever imagine.